Taylaron story. Chapter 3. Erria carried a woven basket a few steps ahead of me. The plants around us were wet with dew, and the breeze brought with it a subtle chill. Erria bent down, and I saw her pluck something from the ground. I stepped closer. It was a small brown mushroom with a fat stem and a round cap. "This one is a common brown cap," said Erria. I gave a nod, immediately searching the leaf litter for the fungus. Apparently, it liked moist areas. It would normally grow under trees. Well, it was some specific tree that it liked to grow under, but I didn't remember the name of this tree, or how it was supposed to look like for that matter. And anyway, wouldn't remembering the tree description, in addition to the mushroom, just be more difficult? I spotted a few brown mushrooms sticking out from a litter of damp branches and leaves. "Erria!" I exclaimed. "Is this it?" Erria approached, holding the basket in front of her, the single brown mushroom resting inside. She peered at the spot that I was pointing at. Her eyes narrowed. "No," she said. "Those are definitely not common brown caps." I kneeled, inspecting the details of these not brown cap mushrooms, comparing them to the real common brown cap that lay in Erria's basket. They were the same shade of brown, the same rounded cap on a thick stem. "How can you tell?" I asked. Erria shook her head. "They don't look similar at all. Look." She pointed to one of these imposters. "Their caps look a bit wet. I could be wrong, but I think these are, in fact, sweat caps." I looked at the mushrooms on the ground again, and then at the common brown cap in the basket. She was right. These mushrooms had a thin layer of clear mucus on the caps. "Is that why they're called sweat caps?" I asked. "Because they look like they're sweating?" "I don't think so," said Erria. "I think they are named after one of the symptoms you get after ingesting them. I've read somewhere that one person had accidentally put one of these in a soup once, and then sweated to death." I glanced at the mushrooms again. They had taken on a sinister feel, as if they were looking at me, mocking me, enticing me to eat them. I stood up, taking a step back away from the mushroom patch, vowing to myself to never pick even a single mushroom without someone there to confirm my identification. Erria was already a few steps ahead, and I hurried to catch up to her. She bent over again, picking another mushroom, and then another one. I glanced around. Another brown mushroom had sprouted near a tall tree, just under a bush. I walked closer. The cap looked dry, not slimy. "What about this one?" Erria walked closer and kneeled, inspecting the mushroom. "Yes, this one is a common brown cap," she said. I smiled to myself, almost giddy. I bent down and tugged at the brown cap, but it was firmly planted into the soil. So I twisted it, something I'd seen Erria do. It came off easily with a satisfying spring to it. I placed it into the basket and looked up. Erria was glancing somewhere behind her, a worried look on her face. I moved my head to see what she was looking at, but before I could spot it, Erria sprung into action. She grabbed my arm and pulled me behind the bush with her. I landed on my side, hard branches poking into my flesh. I looked up at her. She held a finger to her lips, gesturing at me to be quiet. As if I'd say anything after being so hastily pulled into a hiding spot. I doubted she'd do something like that unless there was a good reason. I stared through the thick bush, hoping to see what our threat was. I could see some movement through the gaps of the leaves. A quiet chatter echoed somewhere in the distance. I slowly moved myself off the hard branches. If we were going to hide here for long, I wanted to be comfortable. I pushed myself up with my hand, but something fluffy tickled at my fingers. I pulled my hand away instinctively, and my eyes darted towards this thing. A dead bird lay on the ground. I'd just touched a dead bird. For a second, I'd wondered whether I was the one that squished it, but on further inspection, it looked to have been there for at least a few days now. I glanced up at Erria, who seemed to recognize the look on my face. She bent her neck to look at what I've just touched. Her facial expression changed, but not to one of disgust. Was it Relief? Excitement? She glanced through the twigs of the bush again, probably towards whatever we were hiding from, and then reached her arms over me, towards the bird. She closed her eyes. The bird started to twitch. I jerked back a little, away from the bird, but then forced myself to stay as still as possible as to not draw attention to us. The bird twitched a few more times and then hopped onto its feet, as if it hadn't been dead, just taking a nap. The bird ruffled its wings a little before hopping a few times and taking off into flight. It headed towards the source of the chatter. A few shrieks echoed through the forest. I sat frozen behind the bush, confused. I glanced at Erria. Her eyes were narrowed in concentration. I stayed still, staring at her, until she let out a breath. Okay, we should be safe enough now. They're probably not going to notice us. Who? I asked. The bandits? Erria stood up, brushing off her skirt. She picked up the basket and collected the mushrooms that were now scattered on the ground. You're a necromancer? I asked. Yes, she said. That was a lucky find on your part. That bird should distract them for a while. I nodded, hoping that we'd come across a source of water soon, so I could wash my hands. Anyway, Erria continued, now holding the basket complete with a few mushrooms we managed to collect. It's best we head back home now. We can collect more mushrooms later. I stood up and brushed off my pants, following Erria back through the woods. It wasn't long before we were at the cottage again. Erria sat the basket of mushrooms onto the round wooden table near the window. Mimi was busy in the kitchen, shuffling around pots and pans. The lightwort leaves we'd collected a few days ago sat in a glass of water on the shelf. Mimi reached up and took a lightwort leaf out of the glass, leaving just one leaf in the water. I glanced over the bed, where Elowin was sleeping. Will we have to collect more lightwort soon? I asked. Not too soon, Erria replied. Elowin only takes this medicine once every few days. Mimi turned to us. How did the foraging go today? We only collected a few mushrooms, said Erria. We saw some bandits and headed home. Mimi put a lid on one of the pots on the stove and walked up to the table, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. She quickly glanced into the basket, shaking her head. Those darn bandits again, as if there's nothing better to do. We can collect more mushrooms tomorrow, Erria said. What you've got is enough for today's soup, just to give it flavor. Mimi picked up the basket and carried it to the kitchen counter. And anyway, she continued, I have some new medicines for you to bring to the market and sell. When can you do that? I can go right now, offered Erria. Good. Mimi took a box out of a kitchen drawer and handed it to Erria. I continued sitting at the table while Erria packed her bag and walked out of the cottage, off to sell the medicines. As soon as she'd left, I wished I had asked to come with her. Mimi was busy cooking, and I was too afraid to bother her. I had nothing to do. So, I watched Mimi dab each mushroom with the kitchen towel before placing them carefully onto the cutting board. I watched her slice each mushroom into thin strips, dropping the shreds into a big pot of boiling liquid as she went. The time seemed to pass slowly, but I knew it couldn't have been that long before Erria returned to the cottage. She managed to get a good price for the medicines this time, so although she returned with an empty box, she didn't return empty-handed. The soup had just finished cooking. We sat down to eat. I sipped on a hot, salty soup. The mushroom flavor had infused its way into the broth, flavoring everything pleasantly savory. It was hard to believe that so few mushrooms could carry the flavor so well. Erria and Mimi exchanged a few sentences, but I sat quietly, listening. After dinner, Erria laid out a blanket on the floor for me again, just as she had done the few days previously. As I lay on the makeshift bed, I drifted in and out of sleep. The blankets on the bed above rustled, and I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that it would convince my mind that I was meant to be sleeping. I just started drifting off when the rustling started again. This time, a weight pressed on the blanket over me. The weight shifted over my body and onto the floor. Footsteps tapped through the room. I opened my eyes. catching a glimpse of 2 small feet heading for the exit. It was Elowen. She opened the door, flooding the cottage with moonlight, and stepped down the stairs of the front porch, disappearing out of view. The front door remained open. I sat up. It wasn't safe for such a small child to be alone. The floorboards creaked slightly beneath my feet as I made my way to the door. I walked out onto the porch and scanned the surroundings. There she was, crouched somewhere near a tree, her white nightgown lit up brightly by the moonlight against the darkness of the forest. "Elowen!" I whispered, trying not to wake anyone up. She continued to sit silently, facing away from me. I stepped down a stair. A purple shadow emanated from Elowen's body, like dust rising from somewhere beneath her. I froze. The shadow continued, growing thicker, more intensely purple, almost glowing a dark light. Soon, she disappeared fully into the dust cloud. I turned around, my eyes searching for help, but Erria was asleep. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to help Elowen. I stepped down the rest of the stairs until my bare feet were planted directly onto the cold soil. I wanted to help further, to help her, but my feet dragged slowly, as if in a nightmare. The dust started to dissipate, but there was no glow of Elowen's white nightgown anymore. At first, I thought she'd just disappeared, but there was something there, something else deep inside the purple dust. It was something dark, something that wasn't shaped anything like a human. Slowly, I took another step forward. The dust settled, or maybe disappeared somewhere, and in the moonlight I could make out the shine of scales. The creature turned. I could make out the shape of teeth. My whole body jerked at the sound of footsteps behind me. I swung my head around. Erria stood in the doorway wearing her nightgown, her face tired. She made her way down to where I was standing, but then continued further, closer to the creature. She lifted her hand, bringing it closer to the creature's snout. The creature sniffed cautiously. "It's me," she said. Erria ran her hand along the creature's long, scaly body. I could now make out the long tail, the claws on its front legs. It wasn't particularly large, but large enough to feel cautious around, especially with those sharp teeth. I stood still, watching Erria, who continued sitting next to the creature, muttering something to it in a soft voice. I wasn't sure whether I should come closer and do something, or whether I should go back into the cottage and leave them be, so I stood, frozen. It was hard to tell how much time had passed before the purple dust began to rise again. Erria did not move. She simply sat there as she'd done before, speaking softly. The dust gathered until I could barely make out Erria's shape, and then settled again, just as it did before. In the creature's place lay Elowen. Erria sat there like that with her little sister on her lap for another few minutes. They sat there, the 2 pale girls in white nightgowns, almost glowing in the moonlight. Erria stood up, pulling Elowen up with her. The 2 of them made their way back onto the porch. As Erria walked past me, I noticed a sunken look to her face. Her eyes met mine. "This happens sometimes," she said. Without another word, she went into the cottage and tucked Elowen back into bed. End of chapter 3. You've been listening to Taylaron's story. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter.